The doctors didn't soften their words. They didn't offer false comfort. They told Theodore Roosevelt's parents the brutal truth. This boy will not live into adulthood. His chest was too weak. His body is too frail. Every breath was a fight, and they warned that the fight would not last. At night, the sickness came for him like an invisible enemy. Imagine being a child, lying in bed, your small body trembling, your chest on fire, your throat closing. The darkness around you is silent, but inside, your own lungs are betraying you. Theodore would jolt awake, gasping, clawing at the air, as if the very act of breathing had been stolen. And what could his parents do? They stood helpless, listening to their son struggle, wondering each night if this would be his last. That was his childhood. Not freedom, not play, but fear. Fear of sleep, fear of weakness, fear of life itself slipping away. The other boys saw it. They mocked him for it, called him sickly, fragile, pathetic. And he was. He couldn't run like them. He couldn't fight like them. He couldn't even keep up. So he became the boy left behind, the boy who coughed and wheezed and sat on the sidelines. Now pause for a moment. Have you ever felt that way? Left out, looked down on, dismissed before you even had the chance to prove yourself? Maybe not because of sickness, maybe because of where you grew up, or how much money your family had, or the way you look, or the mistakes you made. The details are different, but the feeling is the same. That sting of being judged as less than. But here's where the story takes a turn, because inside that fragile body was something the doctors couldn't measure, something the bullies couldn't see, something even Theodore himself didn't yet understand. A stubborn whisper, "I will make my body." Think about that. A boy who couldn't even breathe properly, deciding that he would remake himself. Not wishing, not hoping, deciding. And that's why you need to keep watching. Because if someone born weaker than almost anyone else could one day ride with soldiers into gunfire, could one day stare down death with a grin, could one day shape history itself, then what excuse do you have? But don't think this is an easy journey. You're not going to hear a fairy tale. You're going to watch this boy suffer again and again. You're going to watch him break. You're going to watch him lose the people he loves most. You're going to watch him hit moments so dark, most men would have given up. The question is, why didn't he? And how did he turn all that pain into power? Maybe you've had your own nights where you couldn't breathe, not because of asthma, but because of anxiety, because of bills stacking up, because of betrayal, because of fear that tomorrow might not be better than today. Roosevelt knew that feeling. He lived it, and instead of letting it crush him, he built himself into someone unrecognizable. That's the lesson hidden in this story. Roosevelt didn't become strong because life was kind to him. He became strong because life was cruel, because he was forced to either bend or break. And you're going to see how he responded. You're going to see the gyms he built in his own house when he was still a teenager, dragging his broken lungs and weak body through punishing routines while other boys laughed. You're going to see the tragedies that could have ended him, but instead fueled him. You're going to see him choose pain again and again, until pain itself became his teacher. Stay with me, because if you do, you won't just learn about Theodore Roosevelt. You'll discover the secret he carried into every battle, every loss, every triumph. A secret you can carry into your own struggles. The secret that weakness can be turned into strength. That fear can be turned into courage. That suffering can be turned into the kind of power comfort will never give you. So ask yourself, when life strikes you down, when you are mocked, when you are left behind, will you quit, or will you fight? Like the boy who could barely breathe, yet somehow found a way to roar louder than anyone thought possible? Because this is not just a story. This is yours. You may never look at your own battles the same way again. They said childhood is supposed to be the time of freedom, of running through fields, climbing trees, getting into trouble, scraping knees. But for young Theodore Roosevelt, childhood was a prison. Not a prison with bars and locks, but a prison built inside his own body. The walls were his weak lungs. The chains were his asthma. The punishment was that every breath was work. Imagine this. A boy, no older than 10, suddenly clutching his chest in the middle of the night, his lips turning blue, his lungs refusing to obey, his mother holding him close, terrified he wouldn't survive until dawn, his father pacing the room, desperate, powerless. For most of us, breathing is something we don't even think about. But for Theodore, breathing was war. Every inhale a victory, every exhale uncertain. And children are cruel, aren't they? They don't see the invisible battles. They only see the glasses, the skinny arms, the weak frame. They laughed. They called him names. He was never chosen first. Often not chosen at all. Have you ever been left out? Watched others do what you wished you could, while you stayed behind? Maybe you felt that same sting. The sting of being on the outside, watching life move on without you. But here's the thing. Theodore hated pity even more than cruelty. He refused to be pitied. He refused to be known only as the weak boy. Still, the attacks never stopped, and neither did the humiliation. One summer, his father, Theodore Sr., took him aside. His father was a strong man, admired, respected. He looked his frail son in the eye and said words that burned into him forever. You have the mind, but you do not have the body. And without the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should. You must make your body. Most fathers in that situation would have said, "Take it easy, son. Don't push yourself. Don't strain. Stay safe." But not Theodore's father. He told his weak son to build himself into something strong. And here's where the first turning point comes. Because Theodore could have said, "It's impossible. I'll never be like them." He could have surrendered, but instead he accepted the challenge. A sick boy who could barely breathe dared to take control of the one thing everyone said he could never control, his body. So what did he do? He began training, lifting weights, punching bags, running, boxing, wrestling, his small frame shaking, lungs screaming, body aching. He fought against himself, against weakness, against every voice that told him to stop. At first, it was laughable. Imagine this frail little boy trying to lift iron, falling down, coughing, gasping. People would have thought it was pointless. But he kept going, again, and again, and again. And I want you to pause here and think. How many times have you given up when something felt impossible? How many times have you said, "This isn't for me. I wasn't made for this"? That's the difference. Roosevelt didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. His life depended on it. And slowly, painfully, his body began to change. His chest broadened. His arms strengthened. His asthma didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip. The boy who once couldn't breathe was learning to fight back. But don't think this is where the story gets easy. No, the sickness would always stalk him, always threaten him, always return when he least expected. And just when he began to taste strength, life was about to deal him a blow far worse than asthma. A blow that would break many men. And if you think you know pain, wait until you hear what came next. But before we step into that storm, let me ask you this. If you were told you could change the one thing holding you back, but it would hurt, it would take years, it would demand everything, would you do it? Or would you settle, like most do, and accept life as it is? Theodore Roosevelt chose pain. He chose struggle. He chose the fight. And that choice would prepare him for tragedies no child, no man, should ever face. Because sickness was not his greatest enemy. Grief was waiting around the corner. Picture Theodore Roosevelt at Harvard. Thin, awkward, with spectacles perched on his nose. His laugh was too loud. His clothes sometimes a little odd. His mannerisms stiff. He wasn't what you'd call smooth. In fact, many thought he was strange. And yet, behind that odd young man was the same fire that had once burned in the sickly boy's chest. By now, Theodore's lungs were stronger. His frame had filled out, but not gracefully. He wasn't a natural athlete. He had to fight for every ounce of muscle. So he boxed, and it was almost comical. Imagine this bespectacled young man stepping into a ring with boys who had been fighting all their lives. His stance was too upright, his swings too wide. He often got pummeled. But here's the difference. He never quit. After every black eye, after every bloody nose, Theodore climbed back in. And slowly, the clumsy boy began to change. His lungs no longer betrayed him quite as often. His fists began to land more solidly. His body began to obey his will, and with every bruise and every scar, the old weak Theodore faded further into the past. He took this same spirit outdoors, hiking, hunting, rowing. He'd charge into the wilderness with the same stubborn will that had carried him through asthma attacks. He wasn't graceful in the woods either. Friends joked that he looked more like a professor lost on a field trip than an adventurer. But again, the point wasn't talent. It was will. And from this struggle came a philosophy. Theodore called it the strenuous life. To him, comfort was a disease. Softness was weakness. He believed that only by embracing difficulty, by running toward it, not away from it, could a man truly live. Now let me ask you something. How many of us spend our days running from pain? We avoid the hard conversations. We hide from the challenges. We look for shortcuts. And yet, deep down, we know that nothing great ever came easy. Roosevelt lived this truth. He wanted the uphill climb. He wanted the struggle. He wanted the life that hurt, because he knew it was the only way to grow. When Theodore entered politics, he carried this same spirit. But once again, the world laughed. The wealthy elite thought he was too odd, too loud, too full of energy. The tough men of New York thought he was too privileged, too soft, too Harvard. He didn't belong to either world. To the rich, he was eccentric. To the working men, he was suspect. But here's what set him apart. He showed up anyway. He stood in smoky halls, in crowded markets, in dirty police stations. And he spoke. His voice cracked. His gestures were sometimes too big. But he meant every word. And slowly, people began to notice. Of course, he also failed. Spectacularly. He lost elections. He was mocked in the papers. Political opponents called him a joke, a lightweight, a spoiled boy playing at politics. Imagine pouring your soul into something, only to be humiliated in public. Most of us would have quit. Most of us would have gone home. But not Roosevelt. Every failure only sharpened his will. Let me pause here. Have you ever been laughed at for trying? Ever put yourself out there, only to be knocked flat by critics? Maybe you started something, a business, a dream, a relationship, and the world crushed it. You felt foolish, exposed, weak. Roosevelt knew that feeling. He lived it. And instead of running, he leaned into it. And here's where his humor showed through. Even when mocked, he laughed at himself. He once joked about his own loud laugh, saying it startled people more than his ideas. He called himself a bull in the china shop of politics. He didn't mind. Better to be clumsy and honest than polished and fake. This mixture, his stubborn will, his awkward honesty, his belief in struggle, was building something powerful inside him. He was becoming the man who would one day charge into gunfire, the man who would one day face tragedy and keep walking, the man who would one day command nations. But at this point, he was still young, still unproven, still mocked. The question hovered in the air. Would this strange, sickly boy who had forced himself into strength ever truly succeed? Or would the weight of failure, loss, and ridicule crush him once more? That's the cliff we stand on now. And what happens next, what life throws at him next, will be darker than anything he had faced so far. And it will test not only his philosophy, but his very soul. Stay with me, because this is not just history, it's survival. And if you've ever had life punch you harder than you thought you could bear, Theodore Roosevelt's next trial will feel very, very familiar. For years, Theodore Roosevelt had lived with struggle. He had fought asthma. He had forced his body into strength. He had endured the mockery of boys, the laughter of rivals, the sting of political defeats. But through it all, he carried a hope inside him, a hope that one day, he would not just survive, he would thrive. And for a time, it looked as if that hope was coming true. He had Alice Hathaway Lee, the young woman who made rooms brighter simply by stepping inside. She was beautiful in a way that words failed to capture. Gentle in spirit, warm in heart. Where Theodore was loud and restless, she was calm. Where he was awkward, she was graceful. When she said yes to him, friends were stunned. Some even whispered that she was too good for him, this stiff, excitable young man with the booming laugh and odd manners. But Alice didn't care what others thought. She saw something in Theodore, a devotion, a sincerity, a fire. Their love was not perfect, but it was real. And for Theodore, who had lived most of his life under the shadow of sickness, love felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Together, they dreamed of their future. Together, they laughed. Together, they awaited the birth of their first child. It was supposed to be the beginning of everything. But life has a way of tearing joy from us when we least expect it. February 14th, 1884. Valentine's Day. The Roosevelt household in New York was filled with anticipation. Alice was in labor upstairs. Theodore, though nervous, was ecstatic. He wrote glowing notes to friends about the joy of becoming a father. But downstairs, his mother, Mitty, wasn't well. She had developed a sudden fever. At first, they thought it was nothing serious. But within hours, it became clear typhoid. Her strength drained rapidly. By the time doctors arrived, it was too late. Theodore raced between rooms, upstairs, where Alice labored to bring their child into the world, and downstairs, where his mother slipped closer to death. Imagine the torment. Every step on those stairs carried him between hope and despair. A cry of life on one floor, the rattle of death on the other. By afternoon, the house fell quiet downstairs. His mother, the woman who had comforted him through endless nights of asthma, who had shielded him, who had believed in him, was gone. Just like that. And yet Theodore barely had time to grieve. Upstairs, Alice's condition worsened. She delivered their daughter, a perfect baby girl. For a brief moment, there was joy. Theodore held his child, trembling, overwhelmed with the miracle of life. But the miracle was cruelly short-lived. Alice's body, weakened from the birth, began to fail. Her breathing shallow, her face pale. The doctors could do nothing. Theodore sat by her side, watching the woman who had given him hope, the woman who had been his light, slip away. And she did, just hours after his mother. 2 deaths. One day, his mother, his wife, both gone, and in his arms, a newborn daughter, a reminder of what had been taken, as well as what remained. The house was not just silent, it was haunted. Every corner whispered loss. Every stair creaked with absence. The nursery upstairs smelled of milk and sorrow. The parlor downstairs reeked of fever and finality. Theodore was 25 years old. That night, he opened his diary. He didn't write a speech. He didn't pour out his grief in paragraphs. He simply drew a large black X, and beneath it 6 words: "The light has gone out of my life." That's all. Nothing more. Because what words could capture such a day? He never spoke of Alice again. Not in detail, not in public, not even to his daughter. It was as if to speak her name was to reopen a wound too deep to heal. But imagine his pain. Imagine waking up the next morning, hearing no footsteps in the hall, seeing no smile at the breakfast table, reaching out at night only to feel empty sheets. Imagine knowing you would never again hear her voice. How do you go on from that? Most men don't. Most men break. And for a time, Theodore did break. He vanished from public life. He handed his newborn daughter to his sister's care. He abandoned politics. He abandoned New York. He ran to the Dakota Badlands, to the wilderness, to the only place where grief could not suffocate him. But here's the question. Did he run to escape? Or did he run to rebuild? Because what comes next is not just a man hiding from pain. It's a man who would take that pain and forge it into something new. And you need to hear this part, because one day, you might face your own version of Roosevelt's tragedy. Maybe you already have. Maybe you know what it's like to lose the people you love most. Maybe you know what it's like to feel like life has robbed you blind. When that day comes, or if you are living it right now, this story matters. Because Theodore Roosevelt proves something most of us forget. The story is not over, even when the light goes out. And if you want to hear how he came back, how he turned the blackest day of his life into the foundation for everything he became, then stay with me. And yes, subscribe. Not for me, for you. Because the lessons ahead may be the ones you need when your own world collapses. If Roosevelt could rise from this, maybe so can you. When Theodore Roosevelt left New York after the double tragedy, he wasn't running towards something. He was running away. He boarded a train west, away from the mansion, away from the nursery, away from the silence of Alice's absence. He left behind politics. He left behind friends. He even left behind his newborn daughter. And where did he go? To the Dakota Badlands. To most people at the time, the Badlands weren't a destination. They were a punishment. Harsh, lawless, brutal country. It was where men went to disappear or to die. But Roosevelt thought maybe that's exactly what he needed. A place harsh enough to match his grief. A place where nothing came easy. A place where he could forget. When he arrived, the locals laughed at him. Picture it. A scrawny man from New York, with a high-pitched voice and fancy glasses, stepping off the train in buckskin clothes that looked like they belonged in a costume play. The cowboys smirked. The outlaws muttered. The bartenders rolled their eyes. 4 eyes, they called him. Tenderfoot. A city boy trying to play cowboy. But Roosevelt didn't care. He had no reputation left to protect, no pride to defend. His life had already been stripped bare. So he threw himself into the wilderness. He bought cattle. He built a ranch. He learned to ride, really ride. Not the gentle trots of New York horsemen, but the grueling days and nights across the plains, through storms and dust. He learned to rope, to brand, to hunt. He chased down outlaws who had stolen his boat, riding across frozen rivers with a Winchester rifle, refusing to stop until he had caught them. And when he finally did, he marched them at gunpoint for days, refusing to sleep until justice was done. The cowboys who had laughed at him stopped laughing. Slowly, they began to respect him, because this 4 Eyes from New York wasn't just talk. He was grit. But don't mistake this for an adventure story. This wasn't fun for him. It was survival. Every morning, he woke up with grief still lodged in his chest like a stone. Every night, he lay in silence, still missing Alice, still mourning his mother. And yet, he refused to let grief rot him. He worked his body until it screamed. He rode until he was numb. He let the wilderness carve him into something new. And in that carving, something changed. Theodore Roosevelt became tough. Really tough. His asthma faded. His muscles hardened. His will grew iron. But more than that, he began to see a truth only suffering can teach. That life does not care about your comfort. The storms will come whether you are ready or not. The wolves will circle whether you are brave or not. The losses will strike whether you deserve them or not. You cannot choose your suffering, but you can choose what suffering makes of you. And Roosevelt chose. By the time he returned east, he was no longer the broken young widower. He was no longer the frail, gasping boy. He was a man who had been through the fire and come out steel. He stepped back into politics with a new voice, a new strength, a new reputation. He fought corruption. He battled monopolies. He went after the powerful with a ferocity that shocked the old guard, because he knew now, nothing they could throw at him would ever hurt as much as what he had already endured. And here's the secret most people miss about Roosevelt's story. The wilderness didn't erase his pain. It didn't bring Alice back. It didn't heal the scar. What it did was teach him how to carry the scar without collapsing. And that is the lesson most of us avoid. We want healing. We want the wound to close. But sometimes the wound never closes. Sometimes you carry it forever. The question is not, will the pain end? The question is, will I let the pain break me or build me? So ask yourself, when your world falls apart, will you seek comfort or will you seek the wilderness? That's why you should stay with me till the end of this story. Because before Roosevelt became president, before he became the Rough Rider, before he was the unstoppable force of American politics, he had to make a decision in the Badlands that would define everything. Theodore Roosevelt had rebuilt himself in the wilderness, but the real test of his strength was yet to come, because there's a difference between being tough on the open plains and leading men into war. In 1898, America went to war with Spain, and Roosevelt, he saw his chance. This was his storm. This was his proving ground. Most men with his background would have stayed safe. Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a high position, a respectable title. He could have stayed in Washington, sending orders from behind a desk. But that wasn't him. Not anymore. He resigned his post, voluntarily, walked away from comfort and power. Why? Because he wanted to fight. He wanted to face death with his own eyes. And so he helped raise a regiment, the first U.S. Volunteer Cavalry. Cowboys, Ivy League athletes, ranchers, policemen, drifters, adventurers, misfits. They were a ragtag band, and Roosevelt loved it. They called themselves the Rough Riders. Now here's where the story grips. Imagine a group of volunteers, barely trained, sailing to Cuba in sweltering heat. Disease spreading through the camps. Dysentery, malaria, yellow fever. Bullets weren't the only killers. And yet, Roosevelt stood in the middle of it all, restless, impatient. He wasn't content to sit still. He wanted the front lines. And then came the moment that defined him forever. The Battle of San Juan Hill. Picture it. July 1st, 1898. The air is thick with gunpowder. Spanish rifles crack from the hilltop. Machine gun fire rains down. Men are falling left and right. The order to advance? Chaos. Confusion. Fear. Nobody wanted to go first. And then, out of nowhere, comes Theodore Roosevelt, charging forward on horseback, his glasses flashing in the sunlight, his revolver raised, shouting at the top of his lungs. He wasn't just leading. He was daring death itself. The bullets whipped past him. His horse stumbled. Men ducked for cover. And yet, Roosevelt kept charging, shouting, waving his pistol, rallying his men forward. The Rough Riders followed, hesitant at first, then surging. The charge turned into a flood, and against impossible odds, they stormed the hill. San Juan Hill fell. The victory was theirs, and so was Roosevelt's legend. But pause here, because this isn't just a tale of glory. Ask yourself, what kind of man runs toward the bullets when everyone else is pinned down? What kind of man stares death in the face and laughs? Here's the secret. Roosevelt wasn't fearless. He was human. He felt the terror. He knew he could die. But he also knew this. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is action despite fear. That is the Roosevelt lesson. The newspapers back home went wild. The charge made headlines. Roosevelt was a hero. Songs were written. His name was etched into the American imagination. And yet, Roosevelt himself would later downplay it. He would joke about how chaotic it really was. He would laugh about how his horse never even made it up the hill. And he ended up on foot. That was Roosevelt. He could storm a hill with bullets flying, and still laugh about the absurdity of it all. But don't miss the point. This was not about ego. This was not about glory. For Roosevelt, San Juan Hill was proof. Proof that the life he had built, the strength he had carved out of sickness and grief, was real. Remember that frail boy gasping for breath in the night? That broken man staring at two fresh graves? That mocked outsider in buckskin? That man had become the leader who led a charge that changed history. And this, right here, is why you need to stay until the very end of his story. Because Roosevelt's war wasn't just in Cuba. His real war was with himself. And the victory he found, the one I'll reveal at the end, is the kind of truth that can change the way you face your own battles. So don't go anywhere. Because what comes next is Roosevelt at his highest and his lowest. And it will show you a lesson so powerful, you might carry it for the rest of your life. And if you want to make sure you never miss stories like this, stories that make you question your excuses, your fears, your doubts, then subscribe now. Because what you're about to hear is not just history, it's a mirror. And one day, you'll need to remember it. When Theodore Roosevelt returned from war, he was no longer just a man. He was a symbol. The Rough Rider who charged into bullets and came out alive. The people loved him. The nation couldn't stop talking about him. And soon politics came calling again. In 1901, fate struck. President William McKinley was shot. Days later, he died. And suddenly, at just 42 years old, Theodore Roosevelt became the youngest president in American history. Think about that. A man doctors once said wouldn't live past childhood was now leader of the most powerful nation on earth. But here's the truth about Roosevelt as president. He was not content to sit in the White House and smile for portraits. He treated the presidency like a battlefield, and Washington, D.C. was his new San Juan Hill. He went after corruption like a hunter stalking prey. Big corporations, the trusts as they were called, had grown so powerful they controlled railroads, oil, steel, and the lives of millions of workers. Most politicians bowed to them. Roosevelt did not. "No man," he said, "is above the law, and no man is below it." When the corporations tested him, he broke them apart. They called him the Trust Buster. And he wore that name like a badge of honor. But Roosevelt's battles weren't only in the courtroom. He fought for the everyday worker, pushing for safer food, fairer wages, and better conditions. He created national parks, protecting millions of acres of wilderness because he believed the land belonged not to the rich, but to every American. And through it all, he lived at a pace no one could match. He boxed in the White House. He sparred with friends until one punch detached his retina and left him blind in one eye. He laughed it off. He invited diplomats to go hiking, and when they thought it was a stroll, he led them on brutal marches through mud and rivers until they collapsed from exhaustion. He wrote books in between cabinet meetings. He read 2, sometimes 3 books a day. He never slowed down. But beneath that energy, beneath the laughter and the bravado, Roosevelt carried the same scars. The grief of Alice, the loss of his mother, the knowledge that life can be snatched away in a blink. And that knowledge gave him urgency, a fire. He once said, "It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood." He wasn't speaking as a politician. He was speaking as a man who had lived it, who had fought, bled, grieved, and endured. But here's the twist. Even Roosevelt, the unstoppable force, could not outrun time. After his presidency, he longed for adventure. He traveled to Africa on safari, hunting lions and elephants. He explored the Amazon jungle, nearly dying of fever and infection. His body, once remade by sheer will, began to betray him. The asthma returned. The injuries piled up. His health declined. And in 1919, at just 60 years old, Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep. His son said, "The old lion is dead." But here's where his story becomes more than history, because Roosevelt's life gives us a lesson that no monument can capture. He was weak, and he built strength. He was broken, and he rebuilt himself. He was mocked, and he earned respect. He was crushed by grief, and he kept moving forward. He was told he would not survive, and he lived more in 6 decades than most men do in 10 lifetimes. That is the Stoic truth. You cannot control when death comes. You cannot control the blows life gives you. But you can control this, whether you endure, whether you fight, whether you stay in the arena, even when your face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. And now, I turn the question to you. When life knocks the air out of your lungs, will you gasp and surrender? Or will you whisper, like Roosevelt did, "I will make my body"? When grief leaves you hollow, will you drown in comfort? Or will you seek the wilderness, where scars are carved into strength? When fear pins you down, will you lie still? Or will you charge your own San Juan Hill, bullets flying, heart pounding, refusing to stop until the summit is yours? That choice is yours, and it will come whether you are ready or not. And that's why I want you to stay with this channel, because the stories we tell here are not just about the past. They are about you. They are reminders, weapons, lessons for the battles you will face. So if this story gave you courage, subscribe. Not for me, for yourself. Because the day will come when you need to remember Roosevelt. And when that day comes, you will be glad you carried his story with you. The doctors said he wouldn't survive. He became Theodore Roosevelt. What excuse do you have?